If you were to place all the great watches that have ever been made end to end, you'd have a really hard time getting insurance. But as you lay out watch after watch down past Tesco and onto the kebab shop, something will become apparent. There are a whole bunch of really awesome watches that just somehow slip the mind. Just drop right out of there. Here I am to right that wrong and remind you of 10 great enthusiast watches that deserve to be remembered. That is, until you forget them again. I've seen a lot of tenuous association with aviation in my time, but enough about Boeing, because this watchmaker has actually got some air miles under its belt. I'm talking about Sinn, the German watchmaker specializing in aviation instruments. It was founded in Frankfurt by former World War II pilot Helmut Sinn, who took everything he learnt during the war and applied it to his watches. So when Breitling went bankrupt in 1979, Helmut seized the opportunity to take over the rights to the Navitimer. Helmut was actually shot down over Russia and lost both his little fingers in the crash. That made watchmaking the ideal vocation as it saves space on the workbench. As well as making watches that have been worn in space, Sinn was also awarded the contract to refurbish Hoyer pilots' watches back to their former glory. Think of it as redemption for the wrongdoings of the past, by which I mean helping two Frenchmen start Bell and Ross. This work on Hoyer pilots' watches would really help steer Sinn's visual direction, which found its way into 1996 with an undersized version of a larger watch built especially for the Japanese market, the 356. At 38.5mm, it's not exactly tiny, however. It's just taken the rest of the world nearly 2 decades to realise our watches were too big. A recent addition to the collection is the Pilot Classic, which loses 1 subdial for a total count of 2, and comes in a few different colours, with the excellent Product Design 2024 award-winning version getting a smoky dial and aged lume. The stainless steel case is blasted or brushed depending on the model, and gets a Sellita 510 caliber doing the heavy lifting. Also, as is appropriate for an aviation instrument, the watch is anti-magnetic. There's also 100 meters of water resistance, which is impressive without screw-down pushers, and it's also rated for low pressure as well, should you happen to take it on a quick trip to space with you. You never know. It's happened before, and it might happen again. The price starts at €2,390. Watchmaking is all about tradition, and what could be a more traditional material to make a watch from than a beaver's favourite? Wood. Since Louis Erard was created to combine the finest of watchmaking traditions with affordable prices, it comes as no surprise that the Excellence Collection has come face to face with the age-old art of marquetry. Far from the practice of selling howling wolf jumpers under a scaffold frame sealed with tarp, marquetry is the art of arranging small pieces of wood and other materials in an orderly way to create something beautiful. Dating back to the Mesopotamians a few millennia before Christ and referenced by Homer in the Odyssey, people have been slicing wood into thin layers and wrapping furniture in it since long before IKEA. There aren't too many people around practicing marquetry anymore, as it wasn't available alongside HR assistant and marketing exec on the list of jobs offered during work experience week at school. So it's down to individuals like Bastien Chevalier to take up the scalpel and keep the practice alive, and it's to him Louis Erard has turned to for the excellence marquetry. The 42mm stainless steel case is simple, features a basic Sellita caliber with just 38 hours of power reserve and a measly 50 meters of water resistance. But what's going to make the 3,900 Swiss franc price go from bollocks to bargainous is of course the hand-cut wooden mosaic on the dial. Far removed from your kid's popsicle stick collage that you've been forced to display on the fridge, every piece of this Louis Erard's dial has been individually cut with extreme precision to make up the final piece. If there's a mistake, Chevalier can't just Ron-seal the gaps and call it a day. Every piece must fit perfectly, and he can't use lasers either or he'd scorch the wood. Homer would be very disappointed by this lack of progress, but there are only 99 of these watches and every single one has been made by the same guy, replicating the same 3-dimensional cuboid pattern over and over again. I'd want piece number 50, as if he's anything like me, that would give him enough time to get good at it without getting bored and phoning it in. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh invented deep vein thrombosis when he became the first person to single-handedly navigate a plane across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. As he'd already seen the in-flight movie, he was resigned to entertaining himself for the 33-hour and 39-minute flight in the spirit of St. Louis by timing his journey with a Longines watch. This all came about after Longines distributor and record-breaking pilot John Heinmuller helped Longines configure its watches for the benefit of aviators. That included the development of navigation tools as well as expert training in vocal fry. and so began a long and fruitful relationship between Longines and pioneering aviators, including Walter Mittelholzer, Howard Hughes and Amelia Earhart, although she lost hers. Precision was key, and with GPS signal a little patchy over the Atlantic back then, pilots were forced to navigate like the sailors of old, with the sky and the time. A watch running out by just 4 seconds could send a pilot off course by over a mile, and so Longines worked with US Navy officer Philip Van Horn Weems to build a watch with a rotating seconds disc that could be aligned quickly with the second hand to correspond with a radio signal. No one ever asked if they could ditch the watch entirely and just use the radio signal. That spirit of precision in aviation has been carried forwards all the way to this, the Longines Spirit Flyback, which updates the Spirit line with a chronograph caliber with a very specific function. As the Weems watch had been built to allow split-second setting of the time, a flyback chronograph allows split-second resetting of the time as well. Instead of hitting stop, reset and start again, a flyback can do all those things simultaneously with just a single press of the reset pusher, which is perfect for me, not because I intend to navigate the world, but because I'm lazy. The Spirit Flyback is available in steel or titanium from £4,250 and gets a 42mm case with a ceramic bezel and 100 meters of water resistance, just in case you too decide to park your plane in the sea. The flyback caliber is built on an ETA base with an upgraded silicon balance and 68-hour power reserve. Despite the 5 stars, there's no restaurant or spa. That's going in my Yelp review. You might not realise this, but owning a watch is also inheriting a responsibility, because once you have the time, you're expected to know it, and that means remembering to periodically check your watch so you're not late to anything. A forgotten watch is basically the same as no watch at all, and if we're happy with that, let's all save ourselves 10 minutes or so and do something productive instead. The answer to this problem is to have a watch that reminds you to check it, and for that we turn to Vulcain, the inventor of the alarm wristwatch. Starting with Harry Truman, who received one as a gift from the White House Press Photographers Association. This alarm watch has graced the wrist of many a president, including Eisenhower, Johnson, Carter, Reagan, and Clinton. Unfortunately, it couldn't remind Clinton to keep it in his pants. The execution is as simple now as it was back at its invention in 1947. There's a pusher that allows the alarm to be set to a specific time, and once that time is reached, the watch then buzzes like a bee on methamphetamines. That name was a bit too long to fit on the dial, however, so they called it Cricket instead. This is insensitive to British people, however, as it's a reminder of yet another sport we invented that we get routinely destroyed at. To power the alarm, there's a second mainspring, and so the crown is wound one way to wind the time, and the other to wind the alarm. Receiving that wind is the caliber V10, a completely unique movement exclusive to Vulcain, based on the original, including the slow 18,000 VPH beat, which extends the power reserve up to a usable 52 hours. You can choose the Cricket in both 36 and 39mm forms, with the suitably old-school dial design a favourite for the Cricket Classique. It's 12.8mm thick with a sapphire crystal dome to the extreme, and there's a sapphire back too for a bit extra. Well, quite a bit extra. 400 Swiss francs extra over the base 3,800. I just checked, and that's the same price as a Velox window. How many watch brands does Rolex own? Yes, Rolex is one, Tudor is another, and very recently it purchased a third. You see, when Rolex bought Bucherer, the world's biggest retailer of Rolex, and indeed watches, it also got a toy in its Happy Meal, Carl F. Bucherer. Carl Friedrich Bucherer of Bucherer fame opened his first store in 1888, the same year we saw the emergence of a plucky young go-getter called Jack the Ripper, who would go on to repurpose his skills selling Richard Mille. As well as being one of the first retailers to stock Rolex, Bucherer also made its own watches, with Carl roping in his 2 sons, Ernst and Carl Eduard, to learn watchmaking and goldsmithing. Bucherer's own watch brand was one of the first to move to the wrist with a collection aimed at women, and was presumably a big part of the reason why Rolex was brought on board as another pioneer in wristwatches. As a driver of sales in Rolex, a free co-branded spoon was gifted with purchase, which made the watches popular with people who enjoy using spoons. The sheer scale of the Bucherer brand has overshadowed that of the watchmaker, and so there's not only history to be found in its collection, but value as well. So calling the Heritage Bicompax annual cheap at £6,600 is just, well, lying. But when you hear what this watch is packing, the price starts to feel less like Jack the Ripper came out of retirement. It's an ETA 2894 base, yes, and that makes up both the time-telling and chronograph portions of the watch. But where things get interesting is with the addition of both a big date and a proper annual calendar. Not the fake news triple calendar like so many watches at this price point have, where you have to change the date on shorter months yourself, but a proper actual annual calendar, with only February every year needing adjustment. That and my low levels of self-esteem. There are some downsides. It's a little bigger at 41 by 14mm, but that's not too bad. And it does have the water resistance of tissue paper, but otherwise it's an elegantly styled watch with two kick-ass complications for the price of a moon watch. It didn't go to the moon, but you'll feel over it with an annual calendar at this price. The people of Portugal have long since been lovers of the sea, since regular baths just weren't enough to wash all that body hair. Oceanic expeditions started as early as the 15th century, under the watch of Prince Henry the Navigator, who sponsored voyages to the African nation of Mauritania, which, as I discovered in a recent documentary, is definitely a real place and not made up. This head start on maritime exploration meant that by the 20th century, the Portuguese took to water like a duck to water. Just like we saw earlier with Charles Lindbergh and his Longines, timekeeping in marine navigation was absolutely imperative. In a slow-moving ship, even a few seconds out on a timekeeper could mean misreading a direction by a whole mile. Through the course of a journey, that could result in dropping off the edge of the world, or worse, ending up in Wales. Because celestial navigation relies on such precise timekeeping, such precise timekeepers were needed. The Longitude Act of 1714 promised £20,000 for a practical and useful solution, with John Harrison claiming that prize, although he never received all of it. If you could set your watch to government lies, there would never have been an accuracy problem in the first place. The first marine chronometer in 1737 was huge, weighing about 35 kilos. By 1760, marine chronometers had shrunk to the size of a large pocket watch, but the cost was astronomical, £450 for one. By comparison, an entire Royal Navy ship costs £14,000. The technology improved continuously all the way until the invention of long-range radio navigation in the 1930s, and it was once again the Portuguese to be found in the thick of it. It was a request to IWC from two Portuguese travelling businessmen to house the chronometer-grade caliber 74 pocket watch movement in a more convenient stainless steel wristwatch case, and so was born the Portuguese, the simple elegance of which is just unmatched in watchmaking. Even without all that history, it's just such a pretty watch. Like, take it home to meet the parents pretty. At £7,600, this 41mm chronograph isn't necessarily the best value, but if you're a sucker for dials, this watch has one. And it's the Marilyn Monroe of watch dials, stressed with hands and markers so liquid smooth, they make Guinness taste like concrete. If you've been eyeballing the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak for its beauty, quality and that tight V-taper that goes all the way down, then it won't have escaped you that buying one is limited to only the very well-to-do and those blessed with a genetic abnormality that furnish them with a few spare kidneys. Thankfully there is a solution, and it comes in the shape of basically a Royal Oak. It's called the Chopard Alpine Eagle, and in case you're wondering why it's called the Alpine Eagle, it's because the dial doesn't look at all like a butthole, it looks like the eye of an Alpine Eagle. To get that effect, Chopard has used graining so deep that you could lose spare change in the gaps. Some say that when played backwards on a record player, it reads out satanic messages. It's also been told that if you look right into the centre and say Chopard 3 times, you'll wake up in Fleurier with a sore wallet. The design is inspired by a 1980s watch made by Chopard called the Saint Moritz that utilised the same flat links and paired screws at the quarters, and of course benefited from the thunderous success of the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak. And it's back at it again, but what stands out most about the Alpine Eagle is that it very much competes with the Royal Oak in just about every way. The finish is impeccable, which is something the Chopard LUC collection has been low-key known for a while. This isn't officially part of the LUC collection, but we all know it is. Like how Rick Wright wasn't officially in Pink Floyd during Division Bell, but we all knew he was. Just check out the details, like the link joining pins. They're twinned like the bezel screws for a smooth, supple fit. Arm hairs rejoice. And the caliber 0101C. Just look at it. It's neat, it's tidy, it's nicely finished and uniquely laid out. It sits in the 41mm stainless steel case rather nicely, and with the exception of a date window that looks like it's a lot closer than it is, the watch is just a fantastic example of doing a damn good job. Then we get to the price, because where the 41mm Royal Oak costs, at RRP, £24,800, this costs almost half that at £13,300. And I bet if you asked real nicely like, you could even pay a little bit less. Mark my words, this is the watch I'll feature in a regret video in about 5 years' time for not buying. So there's a general rule of thumb when it comes to watchmaking, and that's to put the greasy bits in the back and the sparkly bits in the front. It's tradition. And of course, tradition is there to be respected, like how you respect your granddad by pretending you can't see the wet patch when you go visit him in the home. Ulysse Nardin said, "No thanks," and went to the roller rink instead, leaving poor granddad to wish he'd been nicer to his kids. The Freak X is a manifestation of the frankly unmitigated lunacy of one Ludwig Oechlin, a man who sees watches like Neo sees the Matrix. Instead of layers of parts, he sees torque, power, and friction. His idea for the Freak was actually based on the work of Carol Forestier-Casapi, who created an award-winning concept watch whose entire movement rotated about the centre. Oechlin was enamoured with the idea and wondered if the movement itself, whilst rotating, could also become a time-telling feature of the watch. So in true Oechlin fashion, he just did it. And he didn't just give that ball a little tap, he smacked it out the park and into the next district. Because whilst Forestier-Casapi's concept watch had a power reserve of just a few hours, the Freak, as it would become known, extended that into 7 days. Oh, and not only that, but Oechlin also introduced for the very first time in watchmaking a cheeky little material called silicon. Yeah, casually dropped that in there like he was just seasoning pasta sauce. If ever there was a hold my beer moment in watchmaking, it's the Freak. There were other fiery little peppers in that sauce too, such as the crownless operation and dual impulse escapement. The Freak became emblematic of watchmaking with portals. The Freak's a pretty expensive watch though, and so in 2019 Ulysse Nardin introduced a Freak Lite called the X, and far from it being the Freak we have at home, it took the core functionality of the original watch, cooled it down a little for broader tastes, and packaged it up for less than half the price at £23,750. The crownlessness, 7-day power reserve and dual impulse escapement was lost, but the is it a tourbillon or isn't it freestyling display is still very much present and correct. The 72-hour caliber UN230 gets a traditional Swiss lever escapement in silicon, set with a crown, on what is one of the wildest watch displays in all of forever. And perhaps most strange is that despite being a concept watch from the planet Zog, it's surprisingly wearable day to day. The lugs on the 43mm case are so short it wears well even on tiny wrists. It's even water resistant to 50 meters, so you don't have to baby it in the wet. As you get older, you begin to realize that life is simply a circle. As a baby, you would cry and moan and demand attention, require assistance in the most basic basics, and generally be very inappropriate. The autumn years can bring on similar behaviours, like yelling at teenagers on the bus and writing letters to the BBC. It seems the same is true of watchmaking. At the very most basic end, there's quartz, a 1 tick per second electronic compromise to the beauty and fascination of a mechanical movement. Yet at the peak of mechanical watchmaking, it's the deadbeat, also a 1 tick per second mechanism, but one that should come with a trigger warning for those whose fathers are still out getting milk. Why would an expensive mechanical watch want to pretend to be something cheap? Come with me, if you will, to 1675, to the world of astronomer Richard Townley. Astronomy tends to be the origins of almost every timekeeping story, if you go back far enough. Because for one, we measure time from the passing of the heavenly bodies, and for two, we need good timekeeping to make accurate observations of said heavenly bodies, and the ticking clock created by Townley made second-by-second timekeeping much easier to observe. There's no such fear of confusing the 42,600 Swiss franc Arnold Son DSTB for Nano's quartz, however, since the deadbeat mechanism has been displayed entirely on the dial side. How it converts continuous rotation into 1 tick per second is pretty clever, kind of like a secondary escapement that locks and unlocks. Whilst the locking jewel is held in place by the wheel that turns the seconds, the lever holding the jewel is forced to roll out. As soon as the tooth is lifted free, the seconds wheel is released, allowing it to advance and the jewel lever to retreat under the push of a spring, locking it back into place and starting the cycle all over again. Forget it. Rumour has it the anchor on the other end of the lever is a nod to John Arnold's secret tattoo. A question I get asked a lot is, who do you think is the most underrated high-end independent watchmaker alive today, making watches that are incredible that just don't seem to get the attention they deserve? And whilst that question seems manufactured purely for the introduction of the next watch, it is a good question. There has never been a better time to be a watchmaker not 200 years in their grave, making impeccable watches, and yet for reasons that escape me, Laurent Ferrier just doesn't quite seem to get the same attention others do. There's Dufour, Smith, Bucherer, Journe, all legendary in their own right and all household names, if all the houses contain watch nuts, but Ferrier seems to be perpetually on the bench, never in on the joke, looking in from the outside. I can definitely relate. Laurent made his first pocket watch in 1968, which, if I check my calculator, is 1 year before man first laid his towel down on the moon. He then spent 37 years working for the industry's most prestigious watchmaker, Patek Philippe. If I weren't 38, that would have been exactly the same amount of time I've been alive. Funnily enough, his first job was to build a digital quartz chronograph, a Patek Philippe F91W if you will, but that was quickly scrapped. Mid-70s, he moved on to a different project, you might have heard of it, a niche little timepiece called the Nautilus. It was his job to turn Genta's napkin sketch into reality. His skill set saw him become head of the product development department at Patek Philippe, by which point he decided he'd amassed the skills necessary to create his own brand. Oh, and he'd also somehow found the time to become a Le Mans driver, racing alongside Paul Newman as well. Ferrier's watches are more often than not simple, classical, and extremely well executed. His signature cushion case and spear-like hands are subtly emblematic, but don't really shout. The movements of his watches employ technical ability and astonishing craftsmanship that's easily missed without scrutiny. There's a double direct impulse escapement in there, not that you'd know without a light, a loop, and a few minutes of peering. Basically all the ingredients for a perfect Saturday night in. I've kind of answered my own question here, really. A Laurent Ferrier watch does it all but doesn't shout about it. You have to do the hard work, the discovery, yourself. It doesn't hold your hand and treat you like an idiot because it expects only to receive those in the know. Those that don't know likely never will, and that, if anything, is probably the best reason to have one. Let me know what your favourite forgotten enthusiast watch is down below, and if you want to support my channel along with these guys, to whom I'm eternally grateful, you'll find a Patreon link in the description too. Thanks for watching, and if you ever find yourself short of cash, try taking what little you have left to a casino. They're just giving money away for free. Goodbye.